In our last video, what we did was we went through the process of getting our character sheet application on GitHub, committing it, pushing our code up to the cloud. Today I'm going to start with making some functional components. I'm also going to add in some state management, which is basically a place to store all the data that we need and have a place to retrieve it as well. So we're going to be using Redux for that. So let's just go ahead and start with making a few new folders to house our store and some of our new JavaScript files that are going to be reducers, as well as some of our action types and some of our store, like source.js. So let's go ahead and make a new folder in the source folder. Just call this JS since it's everything that's not a component. And then make some subfolders in here. I'll have the store. I'll have the let's get the reducers and have a constants folder as well. Oops, that should be. Yep, and then new folder. Okay. So in the store folder, let's make a store.js. And I think we're going to need to pull in some new basically requirements for the store, and that's going to be using React Redux. So let's go switch to our terminal and go ahead and do npm install Redux. I believe we also need React Redux, and we'll be using a thunk later on, so we'll be using Redux thunk. So add those in. Okay, and so since we're going to be having a lot of functional components in this is going to be an example of what the model we're following. There's going to be basically elements such as your stats and some of your skills, which are going to depend on other things. And we want that to be able to be accessible from a big state object. So, and then we're also going to want some of these fields to be dynamic. So, for example, for the features and traits, you're going to want to be able to add and remove and edit a list of basically objects or items in that field. Same with equipment. Some of these other things, we're going to be building essentially a list of objects that we can access on the fly. And we want that to be in a basically a central storage location, but we also want to be able to edit those as we go. So what we're going to do is create some reducers. So that contains a logic for accessing and updating those types of hierarchies of data. So let's go ahead and start with these this simple list type component. So features and traits. And what I'm going to do is make basically a dynamic list, so you can add and delete and edit an item in the list. So what we want to start with is let's get the store working first. So I want to import a couple things from Redux. So we want create store, apply middleware. Actually, we won't be using a middleware yet or composing anything yet. So just create store for now. Redux. And then we're gonna have multiple different reducers. So what we're gonna end up doing is creating a root reducer. So we're going to import that into the store so we can have that in our create store method. So let's do that. Import root reducer. reducers slash root reducer. And then basically the store, we're going to define that as a constant. And it's created with this create store method. I'm going to pass in a root reducer. And then this file is going to export as a default the store. Oops, that's not what I wanted. Okay, so now that this is all done, go ahead and into the reducers. Let's do a root reducer, and then let's go ahead and for our first functional component, let's build a features and traits reducer. I'll just call that features, or maybe traits reducer. How about that? Traits reducer. Okay, so going into the root reducer, what this is going to be is it's going to import an element called combine reducers for that Redux offers. So I'm going to import this from Redux. And then we're going to import our first reducer that we just created. So traits cool. And then we're going to create a singular reducer from the list of reducers we're going to be pulling in eventually. For now it's just one, but it'll be more eventually. So equals, and this is going to be an object, and then we're going to make it map, like, say traits. It's going to be mapped to the traits reducer. So it's just one element for now, so we don't have to put a comma really, but and then we're going to export a default of our reducers. But before we do that, we're going to combine it into the root reducer. So const reducer equals combine reducers, and then you pass in that reducers object. And then we're going to export that. Okay, so that's all set. Let's go ahead and put some logic into our traits reducer. So that is going to basically look like, as it begins, just an empty list. And we're going to want to be able to add objects and remove objects from that list. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to basically have a switch state. So the switch, or the switch statement, will take a type of action applied, and it will reduce that down into the new state. So every state basically takes an input of the updated version of that state, and then it's passed through the reducer, and you are returned a new state. So how that is done, I can show you here. So this is the traits reducer. And it's going to equal the current state. So we're going to create an initial state. And that's going to be an array. Since it's going to be a list of something, it makes sense to use an array here. We're going to use an arrow function. We're also going to pass in an action. So we haven't declared the action types yet, but we'll do that in a second after we do some logic in here. So like I said, you want a switch statement, and you want it to switch on the action type, which is something we're going to define. And so you want a default case. So the default, I think is just going to return the state itself. So that's basically nothing's going to happen. And then we'll want our couple different actions. We're going to do add a trait, edit a trait, and remove a trait. So call a case add trait, case update trait, and then do a case for removing the trait. Okay. And so when we're adding a trait, we're essentially starting with an empty list, but what we want to do is basically return that empty list with a new object in it, which is going to be our trait. So let's make a new trait. So let's call it const new trait, and we'll make that an empty object. Oops. Let's do it's going to have a field called a trait, I guess, and we're going to make that an empty string. Oops. And then we're going to give it an ID. So that ID can just be the length of the state, because every time we update it, essentially it'll grow one longer. So if we give it an ID of the current length, it will always be 1 plus what it was before. Oops. So new trait.id equals state.length. And now we're going to have to basically go cycle through the state and add a basically a new node into that list that has this new object. So if we add a new trait, we don't want to add it to like the beginning of the list. We want to add it to the end of the list. So what we're going to do is write a for loop. We can say let x equal 0. And then say x is less than state.length. And then x plus plus. Okay, so we'll say, and then we'll add a condition in here. So we'll say if we find something in the state with the ID that is equal to x that's undefined. So let's do state.find, and we'll call this like a node in our thing. And we'll do node.id is triple equals to x. And so if that is undefined, we're going to put it in that in the state object. So basically, this is assigning the new trait dot ID is equal to x. Okay. And then finally, what we want to do is return a state that has itself as well as the new trait that we're adding into the state. So how we do that is the spread reducer, or sorry, the spread operator. So state, comma, new trait. Since we're returning a list similarly to how we declared it as an empty list, only it's going to have itself, which currently, if it's 0, is going to be empty, plus whatever the new object we created was. So that allows us to basically unaffect anything else other than the new thing we want to put in. So we want to do something a little bit similar for updating the ability. This one's going to be a little bit trickier because we don't come into this knowing anything but the ID of the current trait that we're trying to update. So what we want to do is find that trait in the state object. So how we do that is we declare a constant. Oops. Let's call it trait in state. And this is the trait that we want to find. So let's do state.find. And we're basically going to do trait. Let's do this on a new line just so it's a little less messy. Oops. Okay, so we're filtering the things in the state. We want to do it by ID. And we're going to basically find the integer. And how we do that is we're going to get it from the event payload. And that's something we pass in with the event. So it's going to have that information for us. So we're going to parse it from actions. Oops. Action.payload native event path ID. And this I found from just filtering through this action as it came into the state. The action is going to have some context information around it, and then by going into a few nested objects in that action, we'll find the relevant information we need. And if you want to find this through debugging or however, I would encourage that, but this is exactly what gets passed in just because I know that. So we have the trait in the state now. What we want to also do is get the index of it. So let's get a new constant called trait index. And for that we're going to use state.indexOf since it's an array. And we can just pass it the trait in the state. Cool. So that will give us the index that we need to alter. And then what we also need to do now is basically say, hey, pick this object out by the array key, by the index, and only edit that array's index. So this is a little trickier, but I'll walk you through it. So we're going to make a for loop and say, hey, get all the keys in the state. Oops. Oh, this is trait in state, sorry. So for the keys, we want to make basically, so let's do a new object that we're going to assign to the existing object and then pass in the new information, just in case we need to edit different parts of that object. So we'll make an object called trait in state object. Call that a new object. And so we're just going to, on the fly, do an assignment of all the same keys to all the same and that are in the object to what's existing in the current object. So I keep typing ability, I mean trait. So trait in state object. Let's do keys equals ability. Oops, sorry, trait in. What is it called? Trait in state keys. And since the old object we're not wanting to basically alter that before we append the current state with that, since it's basically an immutable update when we do the spread operator, we want to just create a different object that's cloning all the things in the state except we're just assigning one new value. So how we do that assignment is again with the spread reducer, or sorry, with the spread operator, but we'll do it with setting the trait equal to that first. So we'll call this, we'll do the trait and state object dot trait, and this is the new updated data that we want. Every time we update that trait, it's just going to be a new string of text. So that is going to come from the action dot payload dot target dot value, and what that is equal to, coming from the UI, is going to look like basically a text field. So now we're ready to return this object to the state. So we'll do return. This is another little tricky part. So we'll do state.map, and we want to map the new state to an item and an index of that item. And this is where we're immutably kind of updating the state with that new trait while leaving the rest of the state unaffected. So we're going to do it by the index. So I don't know if we have the trait index. Let's find out. We do have the trait index, so let's set the index equal to that. Actually, sorry, we're going to check on if the index is equal to that trait index, and that's going to be the one we want to update with the new object. So let's put that in. So if it is equal to that index, we're going to do, oops, I'll just make this a new line so it's a little bit simpler. We're going to add in the traits in state object, which is our new object. Otherwise, we're going to just return the item, which is the thing that is what's already existing in the state. So this will immutably go through that list of state objects that are in your array, and it'll say, hey, does this equal to the item, or does this equal to the index of our trait index that we've defined from our object in the state that we want to update? If it does, we're going to pass in that new object. If it doesn't, we're just going to pass it back what it already has. So that should be done. I believe I'm missing a parentheses. There we go. So now we want to do handle the removal of the trait. Oops, I have some extra stuff in here. Okay, this is the wrong type of parentheses too. Okay, that looks right. Okay, now the remove trait is going to be a little bit easier since we're just deleting what's currently in the state. We're still going to have to do basically a find, but we'll do like a filter. So we'll do state. So we'll just return it right away with it minus itself, essentially. So return state.filter, and we'll do trait, and then we'll do trait.id. And we'll pass in the same action payload native event path ID. So the filter, what that does is it removes anything that doesn't match this. Or sorry, it keeps the state, but it filters out the thing that does match this. So anything that's parsent. And I'm going to do action payload native event path 1. Okay, so now that we have the traits reducer, we're going to just return, or sorry, export this. Okay, so this should be pretty good for now. I don't know if we have to, oh, so we still have to create our action types that get passed into this switch station. And let's go ahead and import those, but we don't have declared them yet. So what we're going to want is we're going to want add trait, remove trait, and update trait. So basically that's going to be located in the constants folder. So let's go into constants / action types. We have not created this yet, but let's go ahead and do that now. So constants, it's like a new file called actiontypes.js. And this is going to be pretty simple. Let's just do a few exports from here. Let's just copy and paste these. So okay. And what we also want is we want to make objects or functions that represent these actions. So let's put those in our actions folder, which we don't have right now. So let's go ahead and make a new folder in JS. Oops. Not file, folder. Let's call that action types, or just actions. And let's call this like traits actions.js, for example. So we're going to import the action types, which we've already done. So let's just copy what we have in the reducer. And then we're going to export some functions. So oops. Okay. And these are going to be just arrow functions that take in the trait. I did that the wrong way. And basically it's going to do a type of action. And it's going to have a payload that comes from the UI. So do that again. Type. Oops. Sorry. There we go. Okay, so now we have all the hypothetical backend completed. What we want to do now is let's create, in our index.js, let's bind this store that has all the information about the reducers and the actions and the data object. Let's bind that to our component. So this layout component we're going to give it a what's called a provider. And that's going to provide it with the data. So let's do provider. And so we haven't passed this in yet, so we'll go ahead and need to declare it at the top too. So this is something that's given to us through Redux. And we also want to pass in our store as well. So let's go ahead and do provider from Redux, and we're going to import our store from, I think it's in /js store /store. So our provider store is going to be equal to store, and now we do that, we just set it in the component. Okay, so this is all done. Let's go ahead and go out of our JS folder here, and let's go into our components, and we want to make a new folder for the traits component. Let's call it traits, or trait. How about traits? Because this is going to have basically two different components. There's going to be a traits.js, which is going to be our list of all the traits, and then each individual trait is going to have its own component too, so that we can edit and update that on the fly. So let's call this trait.js. And that way when we go back into our character sheet, we'll only have to give it the traits component, but that traits component will have a list of individual traits. So what we want is we'll first do the individual trait, and we'll do React, and this is going to be a functional component, so we'll import component. We're going to import connect. So connect is essentially the thing that lets us connect our actions to the store. Okay. And then we're going to import our let's get the update trait and the delete. There's a remove trait. So that's in our JS/actions/traits actions. And then we're going to map the state to the properties of this object, or the properties of this component. So how we do that is using the map state to props, and this is going to be an arrow function where we're taking in the state and its own props. And so we're going to return basically a state. So we'll call it traits equals our own props.traits, and we're going to give the ID equal to own props.id. And then we're going to do a map dispatch to props, and that's going to contain basically our events that we want to fire. So we'll call it remove trait and update trait. So we don't want to be able to add a new trait from our individual trait. We want to add a new trait from our list of traits. So we'll import that action when we get to that component. And so basically we want to create a functional component now. So do a class trait extends component. And it's going to have a constructor with its props. I'm going to super props. And we're going to say this dot props. So if you've never made a constructor before, it's basically just instantiating its properties. And then we're going to have a render method. And in this, we're going to set the props equal to the constants of the ID and the actions too, so we can have that accessible. So we'll do const, and we'll just pass in ID, trait, and then our update, and trait, and remove trait. And then we're going to have that equal to this dot props. Since we've already mapped the dispatch and the state to our props, we'll have it basically accessible as a constant in this render environment. So we're going to return some JSX, and for this, I'll just do a div, the class name of a bit of trait, and an ID. Let's make this, we don't have to make it capitalized. So let's do the ID is equal to that ID that we're assigned in our constant above. So now inside of this, we're going to have basically a text area where we're going to have our string that we're updating. So it's going to be all the information that your trait is going to have. So the value is going to be the existing trait. Let's make it like 50 columns wide, just so it's got enough space. And then we're going to do on change update trait. Okay. We can just self-close this since it's just and then we also want a button to trigger the delete of the object, or delete of the trait. So we'll do button type is going to equal button, class name is going to equal, we'll give it a red background, for instance, delete the weapon, or delete trait as a type. Maybe just call it delete. Red delete, and then we'll give it a more specific delete trait, just in case we want to style it. And then we'll give it like an X on the button, just so it has something visually we can link to deleting. That should be it. What we want to do now is export a connection. So the default connect, and so that essentially is connecting our actions with this object, or with this component. So let's connect the map dispatch to props, and then the map state to props, and then we'll tie it all in with our trait. Cool, so that is our individual trait component. We're going to go to the list of traits now. And so what we'll want to do is similarly just import some of this stuff. I'll copy this and just add or remove what I don't need. This is just going to have add trait. Cool. And so the state is going to equal trait. oops, that's going to be the dispatch, sorry. So the maps. That's going to be returning our stateful list of traits. So return traits, and it's going to be state dot traits. Okay. And we're going to do class traits extends component. And then we want to also have a constructor. Let's just copy our constructor because it's the same thing. And we want to have basically declare a function in here that gets our traits and renders them as a list of those components. So let's do const traits, and this is going to be similar to our empty state. It's just going to be an empty list. But we're going to say if this dot props traits dot length, if this has a length of greater than 0, we're going to do some stuff where we add components with those traits in it. So we'll say this dot props dot traits dot for each trait. We want to push to the list, so traits dot push, and that list we want to basically end up containing some JSX, so a list of all of our trait components with, so there's a key, which is going to be the trait.id. This should be in quotes or in brackets. And the key is something that React requires. We want to also just say, hey, it has an ID too, in case we want to reference it by ID for whatever reason. And then we're going to give it the trait text, which is equal to trait.trait. Okay, and then we'll close the JSX tag. That closes the push, that closes the this dot for each, and then the if. So get traits. We doesn't have a return statement, but let's just return a div with the abilities inside of it. Sorry, the traits inside of it. Okay, so it'll start off with just returning an empty div, but if we have traits in our state, it'll pick those up and it'll return that list of traits. So let's go ahead and make a wrapper for that component, and then we'll have to import the trait. So import trait from, and that is in the same folder, so it's just trait. And so we do a render method here, and we want to say, hey, return and oops, it's supposed to be smooth brackets. Okay, so we're gonna just do return a div with the class name equals traits, and then we're gonna have the title of that container. So div, call it traits title, these class names can be whatever we want since we haven't written any CSS for this yet. And we'll call this, I believe the character sheet says features and traits, so let's just call it that. Features and traits. I believe this needs to be an amp for the page to render in HTML since and is a coding thing. Okay, so now we want to put another div after the title that's going to contain our function call. So we can call this dot get traits, and that's going to be our list of things. And then we want also after each list of so after the list of all the things we want a button at the bottom basically that's going to say, hey, let's create a new trait. So that's button type is button, and the class name can be new trait or whatever. Let's do UI small button. Let's make it green. We won't make it actually green yet, but we can go and add those classes later. Let's call it add new trait. And then in that button, we're going to have like a plus. So this should be all done. What we want to also do is export the connection. Oops. And that's going to be map state to props, map dispatch to props. This is going to be pretty analogous to all of our stateful components that we're making. So should be a pattern that's easily repeatable. And we're going to call this traits. Okay, so now we have our two components, the traits and the trait. And so we want to add this to our character sheet. So in place of this hello world, this is going to be our new list that's going to have the plus button and the X button to add any traits you want and fill in any text you want, and it'll update in the state. And then when you hit delete, it'll remove it from the state based on its ID. So let's try it out. So let's get our list of traits component, self-close it, and then we want to import it to traits from traits/traits. Cool. So now that we have everything hopefully in place, let's go ahead and spin this up and take a look at it. So let's just let's just do npm start. Looks like we do have an error in our map state to props, returning something weird. Let's take a look at that. Not sure what I'm doing wrong on this, but let's take a look. Oh, this is not an error function, so we need to go to state. That's what's wrong. Okay. Export and connect was not found in Redux. We imported it from Redux. It should be from React Redux. I believe that's in trait 2. Cool. So store was not found in JS store. Okay. You might have forgotten to export the store properly. It's there. Let's take a look again. Index.js. the store reference should not be inside these brackets. That's my mistake. Okay. Date trait was not found in action types. So let's take a look at our constants. I call these abilities instead of traits. That was my bad. In the old character sheet that I made, it was for 3.5 or Pathfinder, which these are called traits, or these are called abilities in that system. So just going with that, this should be called traits. Everything should line up. Alright, that's my mistake. Okay, so it looks like there's no errors anymore. We'll go ahead and go to where this is being served. It's just on localhost /8080, I believe. We might have some more console errors, so let's check this out. Okay, so element expected a string for built-in components or class function, but got undefined. You most likely forgot to export your component from the file it's defined in. Check the render method of layout. Okay, let me take a look. It's in index.js. Maybe it's not recognizing the store, so we have to set the store to the window so it has actual access to that. I'm not sure if that's causing the error, but we'll find out. Nope. Create element is invalid. Consider adding. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on. Let's double check some of our components. Oh, these look great. These look great. Let's check our character sheet.js. Yeah, this looks correct too. Not sure what's going on, but React error boundaries. Let's do some bug checking. I am back. I just took a couple minutes to look through some of these comments. I think this is my error that I'm making, which is why my component is not mounting and stuff. I'm importing provider from Redux and not from React Redux. So that's a big problem. So let's go ahead and change that. Hopefully this should compile now. Oh, looks like it did. I used the wrong class name, so some more debugging. Let's just fix the rest of this, and once we have this, it should be good. So class name, that's wrong. Cool. So we should have no more errors. Cool. So yeah, this is our features and traits. Let me zoom in so you can see it. And so yeah, pressing plus on it should give us a. Oops, I guess that's not working. So let's figure out what's going on. So. We forgot to add our action to the button too. So we want on click of the button we want to fire off our add trait. So let's figure it out. So it's got this. I have to refresh. I might have not bound that button correctly. Let me take a look. So since it's being passed in the props, we're going to do we haven't declared the functions, so let's just declare that. So let's do const and we'll do add trait equals this.props. So this should hopefully work. There we go. So now, as you can see, this state is getting updated. Every time we press a plus, it's adding a new object to this state. And we can do that, I think we can do the store.getState in our console log to see. And let's just take a look at what our current state is. So as you see, we have the traits, which are our new traits that we added. Every time we press a plus, that will get incremented by 1. See how we now have 5. And then these traits have the things that we included in. So a string and an ID. So if I wanted to update this trait with a 0, as you can see, every time I say hello, we actually are getting another error. So let's take a look and see what's going on. So in our traits reducer, keys is not defined. So as you can see, though, it's hitting the traits reducer every time we fire off that action, which is a good thing. So let's go ahead and look in our traits reducer. So keys is not defined. This is wrong. So 45 for keys in trait.state. I might have declared this keys thing wrong. So let's just take a look. We just need to declare keys as its own thing. So let's just do let keys or something. All right. Now let's go ahead and try that again. It's refreshed. We lost our state, but it's fine. So there we go. We're updating this 0 index thing. And how we made the reducer, we should be able to actually, every time we run the update function with new text, say like this is my trait. It actually, each time I change this input, it's actually running the reducer to target that object in the state and update it with the new text. So as you can see, every time, this is the ID of 4, we say update ID 4 trait. And as you can see in our list, that has been updated correctly. So let's check our delete function. It's not doing anything, so figure out what's going on with that. Let's check our trait.js, make sure it's bound. This is not bound, so let's go ahead and do that. So on click delete trait, or sorry, remove trait. I have to refresh my component. Let's go ahead and see if that works now. So let's try delete second trait. Boom. That didn't work. We might have our traits named different things. Remove trait, that's working. Action types, remove trait, and let's check our reducer. Remove trait. So that all looks right. Let's make sure we're hitting this. So let's just put a debugger in here. See if that's working. Boom. Okay, so state filter. We might be doing our filter wrong. So let's see our action, payload, native event, path. and that's going to be finding our div. But I think we need to get like the ID from that or something. Yes, we do need to get the ID. So let's just tag the end of that ID. Now we can remove our debugger. And let's go ahead and try it out. So let's add like 3 or 4 traits. Sorry. And let's try to delete 3. Oh, boom, there we go, it deleted it. So looks like it's working. Just to make sure that we're deleting the right trait, I want to go add a bunch of traits. Let's delete one that's like in the middle. So let's delete this. And boom, looks like it works. Cool. So that is our working list of editable objects. That's going to provide some value later on because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of things on this character sheet. That is going to be a list of things, so probably like your equipment, your languages. We should be able to reuse this pattern for a lot of stuff. In our next episode, I'm probably going to go into the things that are more dynamic, like these intelligence stats. I can probably add some character stuff, information background. But this is some good progress. We learned a lot about reducers. So stay tuned. So we're going to basically have this whole character object as a state, and hopefully in the next coming episodes we're actually going to have it saved in the cloud. So I will actually work on getting the Firebase part integrated so that you can save your data and have it loaded from anywhere. So we're going to handle logging in, logging out, saving and loading characters as well. So if you like the series, go ahead and drop a like. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. Thanks for watching.